Did you find that card in a parking lot? I need to verify my account. Verify? Private reserve. You really want me to run this?
Want me to pull the lost card list, Mr. Keller?
Do that. Flag it for fraud review. People like you don't belong here.
He walked into First National Heritage Bank in shoes his father had made by hand. His jacket carried the dust of a morning spent clearing out an old repair shop. He asked for nothing except a routine account check. Graham Keller took one look and decided the story was already written. He laughed. He flagged the card for fraud without a single verification. And through all of it, the man in the worn-out shoes said almost nothing, which was exactly the kind of silence Graham should have recognized as a warning. What would it cost him to find out he was wrong? If you're the kind of person who stays until the end of a story, you're exactly who this channel is made for. Subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. My father used to say that a man's hands tell more about him than anything else he owns. Not his car, not his house, not the watch on his wrist. His hands. My father's hands were broad and scarred, stained with leather dye that never fully washed out no matter how hard he scrubbed. He built shoes the way some men build cathedrals, slowly, deliberately, with the kind of attention that assumed whatever he made would outlast him. He was right about that. He was right about most things. I spent the morning at his shop on Caldwell Street, the one he ran for 31 years before his heart gave out last spring. The landlord had been patient, but the lease was up at the end of the month, and I needed to clear out what was left before the new tenants came in. It wasn't much, a few boxes of tools, spools of thread, the hand-painted sign above the door that my mother had commissioned from a local artist back in the 1980s. I worked through the dust and the quiet for about 4 hours, and by the time I locked up for the last time, my jacket was gray with it and my jeans were no better. The shoes I was wearing were ones he'd made for me when I turned 30. He'd worked on them for 3 weeks without telling me, then handed them over in a plain paper bag on my birthday like it was nothing. Brown leather clean lines, the kind of craftsmanship that made people stop and look twice. They'd been resoled twice since then, and the left heel had a hairline crack along the edge that no cobbler had quite managed to fix, but I wore them anyway. Not because I didn't have other shoes. I had plenty. I wore them because that morning, standing in the middle of his empty shop, they were the closest thing I had to him. The meeting at First National Heritage Bank had been scheduled for 2 o'clock. When Northline Systems closed its acquisition deal 3 weeks earlier, the purchasing company had transferred just over $38 million into a new private account in my name. The bank required an in-person verification before I could access the full account standard procedure for accounts at that tier. Or so the wealth management team had explained in the letter they sent. I hadn't been in a rush about it. The money wasn't going anywhere. But there was one transaction I needed to complete before the end of the week, one that had a hard deadline attached to it, and that was what had me walking through the doors of the branch on Mercer Avenue at 12 minutes past 2, still wearing the same jacket I'd cleaned the shop in. The lobby of First National Heritage was the kind of space designed to make certain people feel at home and certain others feel like they'd walked into the wrong building. High ceilings, marble floors, the faint smell of coffee from a private lounge tucked behind frosted glass. The tellers sat behind a long, polished counter, and the branch manager's desk was positioned in the center of the floor, like a throne set just slightly apart from everything else. I noticed the man behind it before he noticed me. He was somewhere in his mid-50s, silver-haired, wearing a suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. He had the particular posture of someone who had been told he was important for so long that he'd stopped questioning it. His name, I would learn, was Graham Keller, branch manager, the kind of man who measured a room the moment he walked into it and sorted everyone in it into 2 categories without ever saying a word out loud. I walked to the counter, set my card on the surface, and told the teller I was there for a verification appointment. Before the teller could respond, Graham was already moving. He crossed the floor with the easy confidence of someone who considered this space entirely his, glanced at the card, and then looked at me. Really looked the kind of look that starts at the shoes and works its way up and doesn't bother to hide what it's doing. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smirk. Something more comfortable than that, the look of a man who had already made up his mind before a single word was exchanged. He picked up the card. Not the way you'd pick up a card you intended to process. He held it between two fingers at the corner like it was something he'd rather not touch directly. He turned it once, read the face of it, and his eyebrows moved in a way that was almost theatrical. The card was a private reserve tier matte black with a small engraved line along the bottom edge. It wasn't the kind of card that went unnoticed. "Did you find this in a parking lot somewhere?" he said. He wasn't whispering. He was speaking at full volume the way a man does when he wants witnesses. A couple of people near the counter looked up. One of them, a woman waiting to speak with the teller, put her hand over her mouth, not in shock and amusement. I told him I was there to verify my account and confirm an incoming transfer. My voice came out the way I'd intended, level, no edge in it, no explanation attached. I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of watching me scramble. Graham held the card out toward his senior teller, a woman named Tessa Monroe, who had the particular skill of mirroring whatever expression her manager wore without appearing to try. "Pull the lost card list," he said to her. "Run it against this number." Then he turned back to me and said with the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes that accounts like this one weren't opened by men who looked like they'd just come from fixing someone's roof. Tessa was already typing. She had the manner of someone performing a task she found mildly entertaining. Across the lobby, the security guard, a heavy-set man in his early 40s named Leon Mercer, was watching from his post near the entrance. He wasn't moving. He was just watching with the careful stillness of a man who's learned that staying still costs less than getting involved. Graham set the card flat on the counter. He wasn't going to run it. That much was already clear. He was going to make a scene out of this, and the scene was already underway, and I was the only one in the room who hadn't chosen to be part of it. I told him I had a government-issued ID, a passport, and a confirmation letter from the bank's own wealth management department. I told him I was prepared to go through every step of the verification process. I said it calmly without rushing because I'd found over the years that the quieter you are in a room full of noise, the more clearly people eventually hear you. Graham looked at me for a long moment, then said he wasn't sure the documents would mean much if the card itself had been reported stolen. Tessa spoke up from behind her screen saying the card wasn't on the lost list. Graham's expression didn't change. He nodded like this was a minor administrative detail rather than the end of his argument and said that wasn't necessarily conclusive. He told me the account had been flagged for further review and that I should wait while he contacted the fraud department. Nobody asked for my ID. Nobody picked up the phone to call the wealth management team. Nobody did anything except place me in a holding pattern in the middle of a marble lobby while the rest of the branch moved on around me as if I were furniture. I had two choices. I understood them both clearly the way you understand something. You've had to calculate before in other rooms with different faces standing across from you, making the same calculation about who you were based on what you looked like. I could leave. Walking out would end the scene faster than anything else. It would also mean returning tomorrow or the day after, probably with a lawyer and a printed copy of the account agreement, and the transaction I needed to complete would miss its window, and the piece of land on Caldwell Street that I'd been in quiet negotiations to acquire would go to the real estate group that had been circling it for months. Or I could stay. The transaction was the piece I hadn't explained to anyone, not yet. The plan I'd been building for the better part of 6 months was to buy back the building that housed my father's shop and convert it into a trade school, free enrollment, no prerequisites focused on the kind of skilled work that kept cities running and paid a living wage. Electrical, plumbing, auto repair, leather work. The kind of work my father had done his entire life with a dignity that nobody had ever thought to hand him, and he'd never thought to ask for. The offer deadline was 5 o'clock that afternoon. If the funds transfer didn't process in time, the building went to someone else, and the school remained an idea I carried around in my chest without anywhere to put it. I thought about pulling out my phone and calling the wealth management contact who'd set up the appointment. That would have resolved it in under 5 minutes, and Graham would have spent the rest of the afternoon finding new ways to apologize. But I'd watched the lobby for the last 20 minutes, and I'd counted 3 other people who'd been treated with variations of the same indifference, not as dramatically, not as publicly, but the dismissal was there in the small things. The way a teller angled her body away, the way Graham's attention slid past someone before they'd finished speaking. Those people didn't have a phone number to call that would change the temperature of the room in an instant. I reached into my jacket and took out my driver's license, my passport, and the printed letter from the bank's own wealth management division. I set all three on the counter in a clean row, aligned the edges, and looked at Graham directly. I told him I'd like him to complete the verification process using the standard procedure. Nothing more, nothing less. I wasn't going to announce what was in the account. I wasn't going to call anyone. I was going to stand there and require him to do his job. Something moved behind Graham's eyes. Not doubt he wasn't ready for doubt yet. What moved there was something closer to irritation, the specific kind that comes from realizing a situation isn't going to collapse the way you expected. He'd expected me to argue or to explain myself too much or to leave. He had not expected someone to lay 3 pieces of documentation on his counter and wait. My calm had taken the shape of a challenge he hadn't been prepared for, and Graham Keller was not a man who accepted challenges quietly. He picked up my documents without looking at them, set them to the side of the counter, and told me to have a seat while he prepared a full review. He said it the way you'd say it to someone you've already decided isn't worth the rest of the sentence. Then he straightened his jacket, turned to Tessa, and said something low enough that I couldn't hear it from where I was standing. Tessa typed something. Leon by the door shifted his weight from one foot to the other and looked at a point somewhere above my head. I walked to the chair Graham had indicated, sat down, and set my hands on my knees. The clock on the wall above the teller windows read 23 minutes past 2. I had 2 hours and 37 minutes before the deadline closed. I had been in harder rooms than this one. I knew how to wait. 30 minutes went by. I tracked them on the clock above the teller windows because there was nothing else in that corner of the lobby worth looking at. The chair Graham had directed me to was positioned near the back wall, close enough to the storage hallway that I could hear someone moving boxes on the other side of the door. It wasn't a waiting area. It was the place you put something you hadn't decided what to do with, yet somewhere out of the main sight line where it wouldn't interrupt the flow of the room. 3 customers came in after me. All 3 were greeted at the counter within 2 minutes of walking through the door. One of them, a man in paint-stained work clothes who looked like he'd come straight from a job site, got the same slow scan from Graham that I had, but Graham apparently decided his clothes told a different story than mine because the man was processed without incident and walked out 9 minutes later with a deposit receipt in his hand. I watched all of this from my chair and didn't move. Graham and Tessa stayed near the main counter. At one point, Graham poured himself a cup of coffee from the station behind the teller row, said something to Tessa in a low voice, and they both looked in my direction. Tessa covered her smile with the back of her hand. Graham didn't bother. He was comfortable enough in this building to let his contempt show freely the way a man does when he's never once had to answer for it. The 2 of them carried on at full ease while my documents sat untouched on the counter where I'd left them. When Graham finally called me to the side desk, not the main counter, but a smaller table set off to the left, the kind used for paperwork rather than proper transactions, I sat down across from him and kept my hands flat on the surface in front of me. He had a notepad. He clicked his pen twice and asked me what I did for work. I told him I ran a technology company. He wrote something down without looking up and asked where I lived. I gave him my address. He asked how I'd come to hold a private reserve account at this branch, and the way he asked it slowly with the same tone you'd use on someone you suspected of lying made clear he wasn't gathering information. He was building a record that supported a conclusion he'd already reached. I pointed to the 3 documents I'd left on the counter earlier. He hadn't moved them. I asked if he intended to check the identification against the account. Graham picked up the confirmation letter from the Wealth Management Division, turned it over once, and set it back down. He said documents could be fabricated and that he wasn't in the habit of processing high-value accounts based on paperwork alone when the surrounding circumstances gave him reason to doubt. Leon was about 12 feet away, standing near the interior wall. I could see him from where I was sitting. He'd been watching the interaction since I'd first walked in, and there was something in his posture that wasn't comfortable. The slight tension of a man who knows what he's watching isn't right, but hasn't decided what to do about it. He looked at the documents on the table. He looked at me. He looked at the documents again. Then he shifted his gaze to the far end of the lobby and kept it there. What happened next was the moment things changed direction. Graham turned his screen slightly, just enough that I could tell he'd pulled up the account rather than genuinely pursuing a fraud check. Whatever he saw made him go still for a second. Not long, just long enough to notice. Then his jaw tightened and he turned the screen back. He'd found the incoming transfer. $38,725,840 sitting in a pending confirmation state, waiting for exactly the in-person verification I was there to complete. Any reasonable person looking at that number would have understood immediately that something in their initial assessment had been wrong. Graham did not appear to be working through that particular process. Instead, he reached for his keyboard and typed something with the deliberate pace of a man making a decision he'd already committed to. He told me the transaction flagged automatically due to its size, and that he was marking the account for a full fraud review, which would require the account to be frozen pending investigation by the compliance department. He said it like it was routine, like he was reading from a script he'd recited so many times the words had lost whatever meaning they'd once had. I asked him to call the Wealth Management Department. The number was printed at the bottom of the confirmation letter. One phone call, 2 minutes, and every question he claimed to have would be answered by someone at this bank whose title was senior enough that Graham would have no ground left to stand on. He said he didn't need to verify my version of events with a phone call when the account itself was now under review. He said he wasn't going to be rushed into bypassing security protocol by someone whose story didn't add up. The school. That was what I was thinking about. Not Graham, not the humiliation of sitting in that chair being spoken to, like a suspect. The school. The building on Caldwell Street had been listed for sale for 4 months, and the only reason the owner had held it for me as long as he had was because his father had brought shoes to my father's shop for 20 years. That kind of loyalty doesn't last forever, and it was expiring at 5 o'clock. If the transfer didn't process, the real estate group that had been making offers since March would have the building by morning, and by the following year it would be something else entirely. Condominiums, probably, or another chain restaurant. The shop where my father spent 3 decades of his life would become something he never would have recognized. The account was frozen. My phone was at 4% battery and dropping. The clock on the wall read 9 minutes past 3. Graham stood up from the desk. I recognized what he was doing before he crossed the first 10 feet of lobby floor because I'd seen versions of it before the gathering of an audience, the decision to make something public that could have stayed private. He walked to the center of the room where the sight lines were clearest, and his voice would carry to every corner, and he turned back toward me with the expression of a man who'd decided to make an example. He announced to no one and everyone that the individual at the side desk had been attempting to access a high-value account using documentation that hadn't cleared verification, and that the account had been frozen pending a fraud investigation. He said it loudly enough that a woman near the entrance turned around mid-step. He said it with the particular confidence of someone who expects that volume and authority will be taken as the same thing. Then he pointed at my shoes, not picking them up, not touching them, just pointing the way you'd point at something left on the floor that shouldn't be there. He told the room that in his 22 years in banking, not a single genuine account holder at the private reserve tier had walked through his doors looking like they'd just come off a construction site. And those shoes were all the evidence he needed that something about my story wasn't adding up. Tessa was standing near the teller row, and she added just loudly enough to be heard that it was possible I was a contractor or a maintenance worker who'd gotten hold of a wealthy client's information. Maybe someone I'd done work for had left their account details somewhere accessible. I asked Graham to provide me with a written record of his refusal to process my verification and the stated reasons for it. This was a simple request. Every branch was required to document formal refusals. Graham knew that. The moment I said it, something shifted in his face. Not guilt, not quite, but the recognition that a written record was a different problem than a verbal confrontation. He recovered quickly. He told the room that I was becoming agitated and making demands that were inappropriate given the circumstances, and that if I continued to escalate, he would be forced to involve security. Leon was the security. Leon was standing 8 feet away. Neither of them looked at the other. Later, I would find out what Graham typed into the internal incident report during the 10 minutes I sat back down and waited. The report described me as hostile and uncooperative. It said I had refused to produce identification when asked. It said I had made verbal threats toward a staff member. None of those things had happened. Every one of them was documented in the system under his credentials at 3:17 in the afternoon, and none of the three people who could have contradicted it. Tessa Leon and a junior teller who'd been watching from the second window said a word. One person was doing something, though. A man in his early 60s sitting in the proper waiting area near the entrance with a leather portfolio on his knee had his phone angled in a way that wasn't entirely casual. I noticed it the same way you notice anything that doesn't quite fit the frame of what else is happening, a small detail at the edge of things. He wasn't intervening. He was just recording. I didn't know yet whether that would matter. Graham walked back to his desk, picked up his phone, and made a call I couldn't hear. 2 minutes later, he was back on his feet, and the call he'd made was not to the compliance department. The alarm panel near the manager's station had a small red indicator light that I hadn't noticed when I came in. I noticed it now because it was no longer the same color. The officers arrived in less than 4 minutes. 2 of them both in uniform, both moving with the businesslike pace of people who've responded to a commercial alarm and expect to find a trespasser or a thief. Graham met them near the door and handed them a printed sheet which I recognized from the header as an internal incident report. The one he'd written. The one that said I had been hostile, had refused to show ID, had threatened a staff member. They read it. They looked at me. One of them told me to stand up slowly and keep my hands visible. The other positioned himself to my left. The lobby was entirely quiet now. Every teller had stopped typing. Every customer had stopped moving. The woman who'd laughed when Graham made his first joke about my card was now watching with an expression that was harder to read. Not amusement anymore, something more uncertain than that. I stood. The officer behind me guided my wrists together and secured them with a zip tie firm, practiced the kind of motion that has been performed enough times to require no thought. Graham stood behind both officers with the flat satisfaction of a man watching a conclusion he'd written arrive on schedule. He said loud enough for the room that the shoes had finally taken me somewhere appropriate. My phone was dead. The account was frozen. The clock above the teller windows read 3:26. I had 94 minutes before the deadline, and I was standing in the middle of a marble lobby with my wrists bound behind my back, and the building on Caldwell Street felt further away than it had ever been. The front door of this branch opened. It was a heavy door, the kind with a slow pneumatic hinge that controls how fast it can swing. It opened all the way and held. Through it came the sound of car doors, more than one closing in quick succession outside. And then a woman walked in, mid-40s, dark blazer, moving with the kind of controlled speed that doesn't look like rushing, but covers ground faster than anything else. She stopped just inside the entrance and looked at the room. Her eyes moved from the officers to me, to Graham, and back to me. Whatever she'd been prepared to say when she arrived, she didn't say it yet. She just stood there, and the quality of the silence in the room changed completely. Her name was Helena Price. She was the regional director. And from the expression on her face, she had driven here specifically to meet the man currently standing between 2 police officers with his wrists bound in the middle of her bank's lobby. Helena Price didn't raise her voice. That was the first thing I noticed. She didn't need to. She walked to the center of the lobby with the measured certainty of someone who had spent years making decisions in rooms full of people who disagreed with her, and she looked at the 2 officers and said quietly and clearly that she was the regional director of First National Heritage Bank, and she would like to understand why a verified account holder was currently being detained in one of her branches. The officers looked at each other. One of them looked at Graham. Graham had the expression of a man who had been very confident 30 seconds ago and was now recalculating at speed. He started to speak something about standard protocol, something about the incident report. And Helena held up one hand, not dramatically, just enough to stop him. She asked the officers if they had received any documentation beyond the internal report. They said they had not. She asked if I had been given the opportunity to present identification. One of the officers looked at the report again and said the report indicated I had refused. Helena looked at me. I pointed to the counter where my driver's license, passport, and the bank's own confirmation letter were still sitting exactly where I'd left them, untouched. The officers cut the zip tie and stepped back. One of them said something to his partner in a low voice, and then he told me I was free to stand at ease. I straightened my jacket and stood where I was. Graham moved closer to Helena, lowering his voice to the register. People use when they want to appear cooperative while containing a situation. He said he'd had reasonable grounds for concern. He said the account had shown unusual activity, and that a client presenting with, and here he chose his words with slightly more care than he had used all afternoon, an appearance inconsistent with the account profile had warranted additional scrutiny. Helena listened to all of it without interrupting. Then she asked him a question I hadn't expected her to ask first. She asked him about the emails. Graham's face did something complicated. Helena told him, still in that same quiet register, that the branch had received 3 separate notifications from the Wealth Management Division over the past week, each one confirming that a client named Darius Bennett would be arriving on this date for an in-person account verification. 3 emails sent on 3 different days, each one forwarded directly to the branch manager's address. She asked Graham if he had read any of them. He said he hadn't realized the appointment had been prioritized. Helena said she understood, and then she told him that all 3 emails had been opened, read for less than 15 seconds each, and deleted without being forwarded to any staff member or added to the appointment calendar. She said the server logs were very clear on that point. Graham went quiet in a way that was different from before. This wasn't the quiet of someone choosing his words. It was the quiet of someone who has run out of them. She turned to Tessa and asked her to input the customer code from the confirmation letter. Tessa took the letter from the counter, the one Graham had set aside without reading, and typed the code into her terminal. The screen populated. Tessa's expression went through several changes in less than 3 seconds. She turned the screen slightly and Helena looked at it, and then several of the customers still standing in the lobby were close enough to see it too. $38,725,840. My name. My photograph. Account status pending in-person verification. Graham looked at the screen. The satisfaction that had been sitting on his face for the better part of 2 hours left it completely. What replaced it was something more complicated. Not shame, not yet. But the particular blankness of a man whose story about a situation has just been contradicted by a fact too large to argue with. He turned to me and his posture shifted entirely. The set of his shoulders, the angle of his chin, the way he clasped his hands in front of him, all of it changed into the body language of deference. He said, "Mr. Bennett," with a formality that hadn't existed in any syllable he'd spoken all afternoon. He said he wanted to apologize for what had clearly been a significant miscommunication and that he hoped we could resolve the matter efficiently. I let him finish. Then I asked him one question. I asked him whether if the account had contained $38 instead of $38 million, he would be standing in front of me right now using the word apologize. Graham opened his mouth. Nothing came out of it. The lobby was quiet enough that the ventilation system was audible. He tried a second time. I could see him searching for a construction of words that would navigate around the question without answering it, and found nothing. The question didn't have an answer that helped him. It only had the true one, and the true one was visible on the faces of every person in the room who had watched the last 2 hours unfold. I told him the problem wasn't that he hadn't known who I was. The problem was what he believed about who I was before he knew. He had looked at worn shoes and a dusty jacket and decided a person wearing those things was not entitled to the same standard of service as someone who looked the way he'd decided wealth was supposed to look. That belief hadn't come from the fraud risk. It had come from something older and more comfortable than that something he'd carried into work every morning and applied so automatically he'd probably stopped noticing it years ago. The money in the account hadn't changed what he'd done. It had only changed whether he thought it mattered. Helena had already moved to the manager's station and was pulling up the branch camera system on the secondary monitor. She worked through the footage with the methodical efficiency of someone who has done this before and knows exactly what she's looking for. It took her 11 minutes. At the end of it, she had timestamps covering Graham's initial refusal to process the card, the extended wait while other customers were served the interrogation at the side desk, the public announcement in the lobby, the moment Graham pointed at my shoes and delivered his verdict to an audience, and the internal report filed at 3:17 that described me as hostile, threatening, and unwilling to produce identification. She reviewed all of it without comment. When she closed the footage, she asked Graham for his access credentials. He gave them to her. She revoked them on the spot, and told him he was suspended pending a formal review effective immediately, and that he should not return to the building until contacted by the Human Resources Division. Graham straightened his jacket one last time. He looked around the lobby at Tessa, at Leon, at the customers who were still there, and none of them gave him what he was looking for. He picked up his personal items from the desk and walked out through the same door he'd been using as the centerpiece of his authority all afternoon. The pneumatic hinge closed behind him at its usual pace. Nobody said anything. Tessa was next. Helena spoke with her at the counter for several minutes in a conversation I wasn't close enough to follow, but the outcome was clear from the way Tessa moved through it. She would remain employed, but her conduct had been documented, and she was required to complete a full retraining program before returning to a client-facing role. When Helena finished, Tessa gathered her things and moved to the back office without looking in my direction. Leon came to me on his own without being summoned. He stood a few feet away and said that he'd known the documents were real the moment he'd seen them, and that he'd known what Graham was doing wasn't right, and that he hadn't said anything because he had a mortgage payment due in 11 days and 2 daughters finishing their second year of college. He said it without asking me to forgive him for it. He just said it the way you say something true when you've held it long enough that carrying it has become its own kind of weight. I told him I understood the math he'd been doing. I told him I didn't think he was a bad man, but I told him something else too, that what Graham had been able to do that afternoon, the public accusation, the false report, the escalation all the way to a police call. None of it would have been as easy if even one person in that room had said out loud that what they were watching wasn't right. The people who do what Graham does depend on the silence of people who know better. That silence isn't neutral. It's the thing the whole structure runs on. Leon nodded once slowly and didn't argue with any of it. The man who had been recording from the waiting area approached Helena before he left. He said he had clear footage of everything from the moment Graham first picked up the card to the arrival of the officers. He asked if the bank would prefer he submit it directly to their legal department rather than post it publicly. Helena thanked him and gave him a card. A handful of other witnesses, 3 customers and one of the junior tellers agreed to provide written statements for the formal complaint file. Helena restored the account herself using her own credentials. The transfer cleared at 4:41 in the afternoon, 19 minutes before the deadline. The purchase of the building on Caldwell Street processed through the escrow account, and when the confirmation came through on the branch's terminal, I read it twice to be certain. The building was mine. Before I left, Helena told me the bank would be conducting a review of service practices across all branches with particular attention to how accounts were handled when the presenting customer's appearance didn't match whatever profile the staff had constructed in their heads. I told her I wasn't going to move the account immediately, but I had a condition. I wanted the bank to fund a financial literacy program, real curriculum available at no cost to families in the surrounding neighborhoods who had never had a relationship with any institution like this one. And I wanted a structure for basic accounts free of maintenance fees for households below a certain income threshold. Helena said she would bring it to the executive committee. I said that was a start. The building on Caldwell Street became Bennett Trade Academy 8 months later. The renovation took longer than expected, partly because I insisted on keeping the original front facade intact, including the lintel above the door where my father had carved his initials into the wood sometime in the early 1990s. The school offered courses in electrical work, plumbing, automotive repair, and leathercraft. Enrollment was free. There was no application essay and no prior credential required. The first cohort had 23 students. By the second year, there was a waiting list. At the entrance, in a glass case mounted to the wall beside the door, I placed the shoes. The ones my father had made for my 30th birthday with the resoled soles and the hairline crack along the left heel that nobody had ever quite managed to fix. Beneath the case on a small brass plate were the words he'd said to me more times than I could count. Don't judge the worth of a man by what he wears on his feet. Leon Mercer took the position of head of security at the academy. He started the week it opened and hadn't missed a day since. He learned the name of every student within 2 weeks of enrollment and had a particular habit of checking in on the ones who looked like they were thinking about quitting. I never told him to do that. He just did it. I think he understood in a way he hadn't before that afternoon at the bank that staying present when someone needed a witness was not a small thing. Graham Keller was terminated following the formal investigation, which concluded that he had engaged in discriminatory service practices, filed a falsified security report, and failed to follow basic account verification protocol. A man who built his entire sense of authority on the ability to make other people feel small will eventually find himself in a room where that currency isn't accepted anymore. Whatever he found there was between him and whatever version of himself remained when the title and the marble lobby were gone. On the first day of classes at Bennett Trade Academy, I wore the shoes. The same ones resoled cracked at the heel, made by a man who believed that what you build with your hands outlasts everything else. Students walked past the case at the entrance, and some of them stopped to look, and a few asked about it, and when they did, I told them the truth. The shoes had once gotten me treated like a criminal in a bank lobby. They had also become the thing in the case by the door of a school that now belonged to me, in a building that once belonged to my father, in a neighborhood that was finally getting something back. The balance in my account was never what made any of that possible. It was just a number on a screen that surprised a man who had made his last mistake about what numbers are for. If this story stayed with you, it's probably because you already know what it means to be measured by the wrong things. The people who build something real with their hands, their time, their patience, rarely look the way anyone expects. Subscribe if you want more stories about what happens when the world finally catches up to who someone always was.